Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. And Andrew, thank you for your introduction. It's an honor to address a conference such as this at such precarious times. Here we are together, apprehensive climbers on a mountainside who are hearing the rumbling of an approaching avalanche. It's not yet in sight, but it's not far above. My lecture is going to touch a little on the avalanche, but not on the horrors that are coming, although I'm sure we're going to discuss those during the day. State of the Union is my subject. My approach will be to take a step back. And my optic is historical mainly and cultural. Today, the Union is dilapidated. It may be disintegrating. It is certainly degenerate. Matters are worse than at any time during my now fairly long adult lifetime. And most of this unmaking has occurred in one generation since 1997. So according to the structure of this lecture is quite simple. In the next 40 minutes, I'm going to explore reasons why it has come to this and how. And that exploration carries within it a glimpse of how things might be reclaimed. But first, we need a necessary word on geopolitical context. With our citizens still largely unaware, we are currently engaged in a new 7 years war, not of our choice, a war with CRINC, China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. And this war is going to settle geopolitics and hence global hegemony in their interests or in ours, just as the Franco-British War, World War, did in Britain's favour between 1756 and 1763. There are also similarities in conduct, because both wars were and are global simultaneously in several theatres, with cold, that's economic, grey, meaning subversive, and hot, that is kinetic forms of combat. In short, we are at the end of history. The original end of history, you will remember, was interpreted as the final triumph of a liberal democratic world order expressed in global managerialism, transcending the powers of nation states through the agency of supranational bodies. This is the happy hunting ground of David Goodhart's Anywhere People. And this 45-year excursion, as we can now begin to see it to have been, began with the collapse of the USSR, when, because we had won, we, unlike the losers, did not feel much incentive for continuing hard thinking. We persuaded ourselves that the era of great wars was over forever. However, circumstances are like clouds, continually gathering and bursting. So wrote John Keats to his brother and sister in February 1819, the year of his great odes. And his letter continues with words which are most apt for us today. While we are laughing, the seed of some trouble is put into the wide arable land of events. While we are laughing, it sprouts, it grows, and suddenly bears a poison fruit which we must pluck. What poison fruit might that be? Now, with all the usual caveats about polls, a focal data national opinion poll for D-Day reported that across all age groups and political alignments, 68% of parents would not wish their children to fight to defend Britain from invasion, and incrementally increasing from 71% to 82%, they would not wish them to fight to defend our allies, France, Poland, Ukraine, Taiwan, or Israel, in rising order. Would the great generation who landed on those brutal beaches recognize the country that they preserved at such cost and that we have now become? Introspective, perniciously ignorant, and unable to tell right from wrong. The Union today is politically and culturally subject to accelerating centrifugal forces, forces that will only become stronger and less stoppable when the approaching avalanche leaps over the crags above us and smothers the Conservative and Unionist Party. So therefore, let us turn first to dilapidation and possible disintegration. Some general election polling reported last week that in this age where politicians of any stripe are distrusted with contempt, the lowest levels of trust ever recorded, and politics have become mean and vindictive, half of all voters, and within them, half of all Leave voters who gave or lent their votes to Boris Johnson in 2019, wished to see the oldest and, until quite recently, the most successful Democratic Party in modern history utterly erased. Not one seat, a Canadian-style wipeout. Why? Well, first and foremost, because of an epic breach of trust and contract. By rights, he should have picked up Cameron's petulantly discarded mantle, but in the single most consequential political act of the last 9 years, the serial political assassin Michael Gove metaphorically stabbed Boris Johnson in June 2016. And from then to now, including under Johnson himself in his golden window of opportunity, when, thanks to Corbyn and Nigel Farage, his 2019 victory with an 80-seat majority had given him full power, and before COVID, when he nearly died, followed by a serious bout of discombobulating greenery, a fatal slice of cake, and defenestration by the ethics director of the Cabinet Office, Sue Gray, the very same woman now standing revealed as Starmer's chief of staff, ended his tenure as Prime Minister, no nominally conservative leader of said Conservative and Unionist party obeyed the unprecedented mandate of 17.4 million usually silent people of England, who spoke then and instructed them to restore full sovereignty by leaving the now also fast disintegrating and time-expired European Union. Under the accidental and robotically hapless Mrs. May, frustrating that referendum instruction was the main effort of her Praetorian Guard, of Ollie Robbins and the rest of the gruesome crew. After her Damascene conversion, Liz Truss would have repaired this breach and much else, and she did have a mandate. But she was expertly assassinated by the reflexively Blairite Whitehall nomenclatura and their media chorus, who she and her team had amazingly underestimated. And Sunak? Sunak has lost his A. He is sunk. He committed political suicide on the beaches of Normandy. Some actions in politics are simply unforgivable and irrevocable. And his callow inability to understand his duty on the 6th of June, even to possess the self-knowledge to know that what he did was wrong, was one of those. But the roots of anger go much deeper, because before the betrayal of Brexit, the Cameroons had signally failed even to try to remove the toxic and carefully woven shirt of Nessus in which Blair had clothed our kingdom. And I mean by that to repeal through conscious intent and with equal and opposite energy the instruments of Blair's carefully executed capture of all the institutions of state, all designed to be interlocking and irrevocable. Unrepealed, these and the supporting quangocracy will all shortly produce an orchard of poison fruit, which we and the Union must eat, force-fed. The Constitutional Reform Act 2005 created a Supreme Court that makes no sense in our constitutional settlement, but does make perfect sense if the plan was to produce political rule by judges and to make common law subordinate to EU law. Undeniably creating jobs for matrix chambers and their like, the Human Rights Act 1998 and the Equality Act 2010 bookended the Blair-Brown-Granita period of overt power, and the latter act controversially so, because instead of being lost in the wash-up, it received royal assent on the 8th of April, 2 days after outgoing Brown, who was newly resurrected at the top of the King's birthday honours, had sought the dissolution which occurred on the 12th, and it came into force under the Cam-Clegg coalition that autumn. And this was a sign of things to come, because the self-confessed heirs to Blair, since 2010, have not dismantled. They have actively perpetuated Blair's legacy, and they've not repealed his transformative acts because they did not wish to do so, any more than they wish to leave the European Convention on Human Rights. And in all of this, they were supported by the effect of an axiomatic Blairite innovation, the politicisation of a merry-go-round of permanent secretaries which simultaneously disheartened and de-skilled an explosively expanding civil service. The 1854 Northcote Trevelyan civil service of supreme merit and impartiality is long gone. A vindictive confirmation bias and a mediocrity regress to the lowest common denominator, entrenched by the shift to quota-driven, not ability-only appointment. And then, of course, there are the grim instruments of devolution. Following Labour's 1997 manifesto promise to hold referendums, Scotland by a majority and Wales by a whisker voted for more devolution. The Scottish Parliament and the Welsh Assembly were elected for the first time on the 6th of May 1999, and later that year, as you all know, Unionists and Nationalists in Northern Ireland spatchcocked together a power-sharing coalition following the 1998 Belfast Agreement. Blair was an expert Gramscian operator. He bounced the electorate around the electoral squash court at high speed between 1997 and 1999. Other examples would include giving away Hong Kong on the 30th of June 1997, and thereafter decommissioning the Royal Yacht Britannia as a sop to his Republican wing on the 11th of December, both, in my view, for no good reason. The former was a massive moral betrayal of Hong Kong's Democrats, and the latter, unforgivably, caused Her late Majesty to weep. The political motivation was, of course, selfishly and nervously electoral, to gerrymander by all means Labour fiefdoms that would secure the Labour Party constant majorities that in a naturally small C Conservative country had eluded it since 1945. But once released from their lamps, the nationalist genies had other ideas, as I've just mentioned, and the rest is recent history, although it is prefigured. For it was Harold Wilson in 1969 who established the long-running Royal Commission on the Constitution, which reported in 1972, the Kilbrandon Report. And although a minority report sought to go even further, Kilbrandon provided the skeleton for the Scottish and Welsh devolution settlements that Blair put into effect. As critics feared at the time, be it Devo Mini or Devo Max, it would only feed the wreckers, and as night follows day, demands for independence would follow. What could also be predicted, but neither in the scale nor frankly in its weirdness, was that once they got going, these bodies would implode in an expensive welter of gross incompetence over devolved responsibilities, police, health, education, ridiculous speed limits, and petty corruption, luxury camper vans, padded out expenses, all the boring lot. Deep mediocrity, as well as avarice, has been the hallmark of the devolved administrations in Scotland and Wales. The cephalological signs are, we are told, that the SNP may well have cooked its own haggis, and we will shortly know, and likewise Welsh Labour its leek. But once established, with lavish buildings, capacious bureaucracies, lucrative net zero boondoggles like Scottish wind power, which is the modern equivalent of trying to distill sunbeams from cucumbers, just as fundamental critics of the late 20th century devolutions always warned and predicted would be the case. The momentum that has developed will prove hard to halt, and therefore the bedraggled state of the Union, still cohering just, and having seen off the SNP referendum on independence, does not mean that the threat of disintegration has been removed. And this is not just for technical procedural reasons, but for others which are arguably more potent and which I will propose before I end. Kilbrandon did not speak of Ireland, neither province nor republic, but I must, and I do so with due trepidation in the presence of deep experts here present. I was lucky enough to become friends with the late David Trimble, who was a member of my London club, and so I confess to being both emboldened in what I have to say and influenced in my views by many conversations with him. First, however, a reminder of a history that still burns bright to illuminate the crisis of the Union today from several angles. For much longer than is required for our present purposes, and often laced with much blood, recall only the terrible massacre of the Protestants in October 1641 and Cromwell's of the Royalist garrisons at Drogheda and Wexford in the autumn of 1649, Ireland has been woven through and through the warp and weft of pan-British politics, and it still is today, and therefore it repays, in fact it demands, study. So we take up the story with the agricultural depression of the 1870s. Irish landlord-tenant relations were inflamed by hardships, which led to the Land League and then to Charles Stewart Parnell's Home Rule demands. After the November 1885 election, when Irish Home Rule MPs held the balance of power, Gladstone converted to the cause of Home Rule. But his land bill to buy out willing landlords and his Government of Ireland bill, carefully furnished with protections for Ulster and for British unity, still split the political class down the middle. Gladstone proclaimed it a golden moment of the type which rarely returns, and yet Home Rule was defeated twice, with a majority of 30 in June 1886 by a broad coalition spanning John Bright's nonconformists, Joe Chamberlain's radicals, and the Marquis of Hartington's Whigs, and then again in the Lords in 1892, when the Marquis of Salisbury declared that Gladstone had no mandate for so fundamental an action as touched the Irish Acts of Parliamentary Union of 1800. Having now become the Duke of Devonshire, Hartington moved its rejection, which in the Lords was by a majority of 419 to 41. The Duke had personal reason, of course, for his belief that force should first suppress rebellion, because Irish rebels had assassinated his younger brother, Lord Frederick Cavendish, in 1882. But the broad fear which drove those defeats is with us still, that devolution, even as controlled as Gladstone's, might unravel Britain and the Empire. And bearing this in mind, I would like to mention one fact and one hypothetical. So back in recent history, the fact, in my view, is that Northern Ireland, where Union sentiment has consistently been stronger than anywhere else in the kingdom, was twice made victim to other people's meddling grand designs. First, Blair's. Unnecessary and unforced, his 1997 Belfast Agreement, like the simultaneous but different processes for Scotland and Wales, set a ball rolling which had wrecking potential. Likewise, weaponization of the province in efforts to obstruct Brexit overall began under May, and they were picked up under Sunak in his pleadingly named Windsor Framework. The common engine, however, was not as much political as it was administrative. Fueled after 2016 by the Blairite civil service's cold fury at Brexit and its principled allegiance to higher authority than that of Parliament, as witness the First Division Association's current action before the High Court, for judicial review of the Rwanda policy, where it is seeking a ruling that, incredibly, the British civil service serves international law above national law. But invoking Good Friday or sounding a monarchy dog whistle does not conceal pernicious effects. Blair's meddling emboldened the Sinn Féin cause of United Ireland, and as well as doing that, May Sunak's machinations sought to entrap the entire kingdom in subordination to the spider's web of European Union rules, regulations, and structures by threatening to and actually dividing the province from the rest of the kingdom. The historical hypothesis is about one of those inflection points when historians tend to agree things could have easily gone very differently. Yes, and often and understandably, the winners strive to hold the pen for the first draft of history, and certainly that has been true in the construction of the foundation myths of the Irish Free State, freighted as they are with the sense that they owned the future of the island. But for De Valera and Michael Collins and the hardline nationalist colleagues, it was by no means preordained that the British would bungle militarily and then supply them with 15 court-martialed and shot national martyrs as a bonus in their handling of the Easter Rising of 1916. The genius of Victorian Empire was its instinct to co-opt its subjects. From the late 18th century, a controlled devolution through land and tax reforms proceeded across the Raj. Actual land users' land rights, the so-called Riadwari rights in Madras in the south, were strengthened in the Munro permanent settlement, and serious powers were devolved to the princely states of Rajasthan with British advisors in the north. The lesson taken at the time from the Indian Mutiny of 1857 was, don't push people culturally too far. But the micro-historical studies of Eric Stokes and the School of Cambridge Indianists has shown that away from the military cantonments, unrest in India was more a demand for inclusion in than rejection of imperial rule. And this same lesson was in turn applied by an old India Hans, Frederick Lugard, in northern Nigeria, and then across all direct administered British colonial Africa after the First World War through the practice of indirect rule. And in the same way, in May 1940, the Colonial Development and Welfare Act was passed during the darkest hour as a promise of welfare colonialism to the African colonies after the Second War. And the aim throughout was to gain legitimacy by co-option and thereby to ward off rebellion. After all the anguish of the Home Rule issue over the previous 30 years, in May 1914, Home Rule for Ireland within the United Kingdom, all of Ireland, was quietly passed into law. Implementation was to be held in abeyance until the end of hostilities that were clearly coming, just like the CD&W Act was to be in the next war. With Home Rule secured, John Redmond of the moderate Irish Parliamentary Party supported Home Rule and the war effort. Indeed, he lost a brother. And by remarkable margins, the position was widely supported in all Ireland. However, it was vehemently opposed by radical nationalists. Poet and revolutionary Desmond Fitzgerald, the father of Garrett Fitzgerald, later the Taoiseach, wrote, and I quote, "Home Rule was in the air. The overwhelming majority of the people supported Redmond. Our dream castles toppled about us with a crash. The Irish people had recognized themselves as part of England. And 210,000 Irishmen of all persuasions had joined up for king and country. Something had to be done, and something was. The radical nationalists sought material German support for their rising, remember Roger Casement and arms shipments in the German submarine, that they might reap their reward after German victory. Therefore, although it was a perfectly reasonable legal response to armed insurrection in wartime, the execution of the 15 was a political disaster because opinion in Ireland was shocked and it began to move away from Redmond, and Sinn Féin began to win by-elections. And thus, the third golden moment to secure all Ireland within the United Kingdom was lost. But the hypothetical, what if? What if the British had not fallen into the nationalist trap? What if with strong majority backing, Redmond and the moderates had prevailed, and Home Rule institutions had bedded in happily by 1921? No civil war, no black and tans, no burning of the 76 big houses in the west of Ireland, no Free State, and later no Scottish Nationalist Party, and Gladstone's Government of Ireland Act rather than kill Brandon as a devolution model, if ever need arose, which it might well not have done. And, as was mentioned by the previous speaker, even in 2024, with a Russian submarine skulking around the Corrib, the Republic's only gas field, which keeps the lights on in a foolishly fantasy net zero Ireland, it is the RAF and the Royal Navy, backed up by non-EU NATO members, which come to protect the defenceless Republic, almost as if Redmond did prevail. Is this not odd? But then, we are so very close, as would have been clear to anyone watching the Irish Guards trooping the colour last Saturday, and even more so, listening to the all-Ireland mixture of the soldiers' accents. Edith Somerville of Drishane House, West Cork, which was not burnt down in 1920-21, and Martin, actually Violet Ross, her second cousin, were two high-spirited and highly talented ladies of the Anglo-Irish ascendancy. An author and brilliant artist, Somerville was also the first Lady MFH of an Irish pack of foxhounds, the West Carbery. And Ross was not a woman who identified as a man. First published in 1899, their stories of the rollicking adventures of the Irish RM, a British resident magistrate in the rural west of Ireland, are not caricature anti-Irish tales. Major Yates was usually the butt of the jokes. And all the characters are lovingly observed, many originally drawn from life at Skibbereen Magistrates' Court, for these ladies were Irish to the bone. In the film version, which is by and large remarkably faithful to the text, there is an exchange inserted in one tale which is not in the books, but which ought to be. and it's between the magistrate's wife, Mrs. Philippa Yates, and Slipper, the all-round fixer and whipper-in to Major Yates's Irish foil, master of Foxhound's Flurry Knox, as they dance together at the tenants' ball at a Solus castle. So the English are the I'm not going to do an Irish accent. So the English are the English, and the Irish are the Irish, and they know each other. So they do, as the fox and the hound, said Slipper. Yes, replies Mrs. Yates, but which is which? My third capital D is for degeneracy, and that is a strong word deliberately chosen as we transfer our gaze to cultural rather than to political processes. In the last part of this lecture, I shall suggest that the Union is in perhaps its greatest peril, not from the obliterating avalanche, which is a consequence, but because Britain, and especially England, has lost its song, which is the cause, and the voices to sing it. In the swinging 60s, few universities, not even Cambridge, escaped the shock of the new. Sir James Stirling landed his spaceship modernist creation on Sidgwick Avenue to be the new home of the Seeley Historical Library, where, God help me, I used to work as an earnest undergraduate 55 years ago. And when years later I was on the faculty board, we had a special subcommittee, can you believe, devoted solely to the unremitting technical flaws of this monstrous building. In my day, it was called the Seeley Library. Today, if you look up on the website, it is the Stirling building containing the Seeley Library, because in sensitive circles, Seeley's name has become problematic of late. And yet it is the name of the library which carries us into our final topic. So J.R. Seeley was Regius Professor of Modern History and a Fellow of Gonville and Caius. And in 1883, he delivered 2 courses of lectures entitled The Expansion of England. His style was of his age, of course, but his insights remain fresh, and 2 in particular can serve us well. He opens by asking a simple question that's actually central, I think, to our topic today. What is the general drift or goal of English history? And he responds that the words that jump to our lips in answer are liberty, democracy. But these he immediately qualifies. They are not so much an end to which we have been tending as a possession which we have long enjoyed. So what then has been the central trend? Why, surely, he replies, the simple, obvious fact of the extension of the English name into other countries of the globe, the foundation of Greater Britain. And this expansion, which defined and dominated 3 centuries of English history, was, Seeley suggested, accomplished with characteristic indifference. And in his most enduring phrase, he observed that we seemed, as it were, to have conquered and peopled half the world in a fit of absence of mind. In consequence thereof, England's story of expansion from no possessions outside Europe before the reign of Elizabeth I to the globe encircled by Victoria's reign had hardly changed a developing sense of continuous national identity to a degree unlike anywhere else in Europe. Sharply distinct also, quite different from Francophone empire, was that continuity shaped how we thought about empire much more as a mission than as an organic possession. British singularity was best expressed, in my view, in one of the most important documents in modern British history, written by Britain's most consequential Foreign Secretary. In his great state paper of the 5th of May, 1820, Viscount Castlereagh provided both a blueprint for British conduct in European affairs, which held its bearings from Canning to Lord Salisbury, but he also sang a song of coherent British identity, which would still have been recognised by the great generation of D-Day, now passing, but which has been broken and forgotten today, as the D-Day poll with which I opened suggests. The fact is, Castlereagh wrote, that we do not and cannot feel alike upon all subjects. Our position, our institutions, the habit of thinking, the prejudice of our people render us essentially different. We, meaning Great Britain, shall be found in our place when actual danger menaces the system of Europe. But this country cannot and will not act upon abstract and speculative principles of precaution, so climate catastrophists, please note. To understand British politics, Seeley suggested, knowledge of history is not optional. Politics are vulgar, he said, when they are not liberalised by history, And history fades into mere literature when it loses sight of its relation to practical politics. Expressing the same belief which shaped the first half of this lecture, he concluded with prescient words. When the crisis arrives, it will throw a wonderful light back upon our past history. All that amazing expansion which has taken place since the reign of George II will then begin to impress us differently. And just this happened in both world wars. It has become a commonplace, made common by the social theorist Benedict Anderson, that is nonetheless true, that the glue which sticks us together is shared memory and associated acts of imagination. The durability of society under the stress of crisis lies in the strength of its imagined community, and that was J.R. Seeley's point too. And the strength of the Union always lay in its harnessing of multiple identities at multiple scales, a sort of set of matryoshka dolls, all different, but in mutually reinforcing common strength, so that the whole is more than the sum of its parts, and it is intergenerational too, works compact between the living, the dead, and the unborn. Many of the outward and visible signs which compose the semiotic shorthand for the strength of common British identity are still there: ceremonial, visible, audible, trooping the colour, a monarch who has to be seen, to be believed, and the brass voice of England's song. In my little West Country village, the distinctive peal of English full-circle change-rung bells serves as a living illustration. Starting before the Reformation, our first two bells, our two oldest, were cast in 1450 and 1499, bracketing the War of the Roses. Two more came in 1709, the year of the Great Frost. Then there was one each in 1853, the start of the Crimean War, and in 1952, the year of the first British A-bomb test at Montebello. And Dove's Guide to Bells, for those of you who like these things, will show that that is not atypical in towers across the country. And those bells rang in the peace of the E-Day after the wartime silence, when they were only to have been rung in the event of German invasion. They've been the accompaniment to every major national event, most recently the 80th anniversary of D-Day. In his England an Elegy, the much-missed Sir Roger Scruton made many similar observations. Yet it is our late Queen's shrewd comment that nails it: to be believed. Once there was a tripod foundation of shared belief that was normal and therefore unremarkable: God, King, and country. Knock out one and the triangle contorts, it crumbles, or worse, it's reconstructed with new and strange beliefs that will soon change all the rest. On Dover Beach, Matthew Arnold had sensed that the sea of faith was once too at the full, and round earth's shores like the folds of a bright girdle furled, but now I only hear its melancholy long withdrawing roar, and we are here, as on a darkling plain, swept with confused alarms of struggle and flight, where ignorant armies clash by night. Or put simply, there's a God-shaped hole in all of us. Anthropologists of religion have long studied it systematically, and while it goes far beyond the remit of these remarks, the conclusion is that the hole being there, it's simply a matter of what fills it. Starting with the honest-to-God debate in 1963 and rapidly accelerating to present pitch in Archbishop Welby's vinegary fixation with fashionable political false narratives, such as that the Church of England was implicated in the slave trade and therefore owes reparations to someone, neither of which is historically true, the established church has been steadily vacating its mission space with a melancholy, long, withdrawing whimper. And what has filled the God-shaped hole today are intemperate cult-like beliefs that are by definition exclusive and which brook no dissent. Do you remember Seeley's first answer? Liberty was our enduring inheritance that made us so different for so long. So let's end with a quick dive into the philosophical origins of modern liberalism, because, ladies and gentlemen, they are not what they seem to be. Far from barring the gates to the barbarians, they have let them in, and with them, corrosive dogmatisms that dissolve the imagined community that once we all shared. And where would an educated audience reflexively look? to find conventional expression of that liberty of which Seeley spoke. John Stuart Mill combined his loftier doctrinal ambitions with a general sentiment, which he believed was a new philosophy, expressed as an art of life to be promulgated by a new clerisy of refined minds. These rare intellects were to be latter-day successors of Plato's guardians, people who rose above what he called the collective mediocrity, because Mill both scorned and feared the plebs, subsisting in a conjunction between the essence of practice and of science that we now call sociology. From Kant, Mill took on a strong belief in three phases of historical progression, distinguished by their prime drivers: theological first, then metaphysical by reference to general laws, and finally scientific, and of course he located his own general reasoning within that apex stage. 60 years ago, in his lapidary demolition of Mill's claim to philosophical status and of a lax reading of On Liberty as the taproot for today's genial liberalism, Maurice Cowling showed that Mill's legacy was rather more one of moral totalitarianism than of individual freedom of choice. That, as Mill construed it, the principle of individuality detracted from rather than maximized human freedom, and his general reasoning was primarily a source of slogans, or virtue signals as we would call them in modern coinage, in the mouths of those who deal only with blocky big ideas at the totemic level. No one knows less than someone who thinks his knowledge is greater than it is, Cowling wrote, his pen dipped in acid and prescient admonition. For while ignorant of or disinterested in their origins, contemporary iterations of Mill's liberalism by modern clerices are powerful sources of grave weakness as the hinge of history turns once more. Liberal language, abused and hijacked, has undone us. It has sapped self-confidence and our ability to say what we stand for as we once again square up to totalitarian creeds. Its bossiness and arrogance have facilitated rather than resisted the seepage of new cults of poison into our children's minds through their smartphones. And in a strange and bitter twist, the three-beat historical progression of Comte and Mill has shown itself to be not linear but circular. It is like a salamander that bites its own tail. For the positivist scientific phase, in which explanations arise from hypotheses formed by creative doubt and the application of specific laws to explain specific data, has halted, and it has arced back into the theological. Today, a caustic epistemological relativism has combined with those totalitarian reflexes always latent in elite liberalism to form intractable belief clusters. And these confirmation biases are superstimulated by silo knowledge from narrowcast media, and they are protected and projected by clerices who seek, with laws, to put their cults beyond debate. Therefore, the science is made impervious to falsification in the eye of the believer, and skeptics already risk bankruptcy and will soon risk jail for questioning it. And this, my friends, is how freedom of speech and thought die, as George Orwell predicted with chilling precision. The contamination of two areas of complex science has been at the leading edge of this process, each of which could be the subject of a full separate lecture. The study of global climate systems since the turn of the century, something in which I've been engaged myself at high level since 1998, is one, and virology and vaccinology, likewise but faster, since the willful misdiagnosis and mismanagement of the COVID pandemic, is the other. If you then add in ideological trashing and deletion of our history, the inverted anti-white racism of BLM, and the whole 9 yards of equality, diversity, and inclusion wokery, all, by the way, actively promoted by subversive grey war actions from our enemies. Applied psychology, led by the intelligence services, has found that the dwell time in a normal human mind for such cults is no more than a couple of years, hence the sequential pattern. But since 710, these previously sequential cults in the West have fused, which is something new. They have poured into the crucible of anti-Semitism, the oldest hatred, to create a veritable witch's brew, which contains madnesses like Queers for Palestine and no climate justice on Israeli-occupied lands. This from Greta Thunberg wearing her keffiyeh. And against this, for both practical political reasons of the gross breaches of trust which are now currently driving electoral fury, and because of the flaws inbuilt in a mill-derived elite version of liberalism, the Union and those who cherish it stand today vulnerable, but not defenceless, because I hope that in what I've said you can begin to glimpse the escape route. The escape route is the reversal of all that I've described that's brought us to our knees and will shortly rub our faces in the dust, both politically and culturally, and we start with the latter. We have to find ways to give the Union back its voice, and who will sing with human voices, not only be called by bells? At the epicenter of recovery for the Union is what Roger Scruton called oikophilia, love of home. The only chance, in my view, that we have to rebuild the Union with a capital U is to fight policy by policy those forces that are devastating that other Union that underlies everything, the little platoons of men and women raising their families. It is the coerced inability of couples to sustain family traditions of custom and wealth that creates the vacuum of which the God-shaped whole is a part. It goes without saying that recreating the conditions for robust family life is difficult. The restitution will not be unopposed. But the family is dying through 1,000 wounds, all of which must be searched, as medieval surgeons would have said, searched to remove foreign bodies and dressed before they can be healed. The fight, ladies and gentlemen, will be vigorous. The reward of the victory will be slow in coming, but this alone will permit the re-emergence of that quasi-mystical bond of common interest that we call nationhood. It will be a work of many hands and minds. I do not expect to live to see it achieved. But the D-Day peal in our local church, and the crowds on the Mall at Trooping the Colour last week, and the conversations with my farming and hunting neighbours at home give me confidence, as similar conversations once heartened Roger Scruton, by the way, that, and I will quote it once more, when the crisis arrives, it will throw a wonderful light back upon our past history, prerequisite to remaking anew our Union, but under fire.